The Prime Minister announced a one-time top-up of legal aid funding for Ontario earlier today. The federal government will provide the province with $26.8 million for refugees and immigrants. Trudeau says it's to compensate for cuts the Ford government made in its April budget. But the Ontario government insists Ottawa's just providing money Queen's Park has been asking for since March to help the province cope with the influx of refugee claimants. So who should be picking up the tab for increased strains on legal aid? We'll hear from the Ontario government in a moment. First, though, Reef Irani is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice. He joins us now from Toronto. Hi, Mr. Bharani. Great to see you again.
Good to see you too, Vashi.
So the argument from the province is that the costs associated with refugee settlements fall under federal jurisdiction. Do they have a point? Are they right?
The costs for refugees and the treatment in the courts and refugee resettlement are a matter of shared jurisdiction. So it's both the provincial governments that step up around the country as well as the federal government. Obviously, the federal government has a role, and we exercise that role today.
They say, though, that they have been asking for months for you to exercise that role, that they first wrote to the federal government back in March. They said that there was going to be a shortfall, that essentially the argument they're making is that since 2013-14, the increase in cost to the province have been about 58% rather, for legal aid, and that the federal contribution hadn't been increasing at the same rate. So what's your response to them?
So we have some dispute with the numbers. We've actually been steadily increasing legal aid across all sectors, including legal aid for criminal matters. But in immigration matters, the increase has been in the area of around 148%. But I think what viewers need to step back and think about here is that there were a series of legal aid cuts that were implemented by Doug Ford's government in this province. Those cuts were across the board. They were to legal aid clinics, etc. They eliminated entirely legal aid for immigrant and refugee matters. That, to me, is a decision that's effectively morally bankrupt. We're talking about the most marginalized, the most vulnerable population that exists in our country right now, are people that have come from a different country, facing torture, facing persecution, don't understand the language of the culture, asking them to be unrepresented in front of an adjudicator that they can't likely comprehend. That, to me, is not justice. That is a lack of access to justice. That is why we stepped in. It's an urgent situation that required an urgent response.
If it's so urgent, why did you wait until now to make the decision to step in? The budget came out back in April.
We had made increases in the budget in April. We had endeavored to have conversations with the previous Attorney General provincially, Caroline Mulroney. When she was removed from that position, we had an overture and some correspondence with Doug Downey, the provincial Attorney General. All of those overtures have not been met with a response. We have sat down with other provincial Attorneys General with great success. We're looking to have federal and provincial cooperation on this matter, as we have had in many years past with different stripes of governments, whether that's a Conservative government federally dealing with provincial Liberals or vice versa. We are endeavoring to do that again, but what we did is step in surgically now because the urgency was present. The impacts of the cuts were being felt actively by people who are losing immigration hearings, being then subject to potential deportations to situations where they could face physical harm.
So I just want to be clear, there were conversations between the time of the budget or prior, because what the province is saying that they initially wrote to the federal government on March 15th, and they again wrote in May after. They're saying that they were making this argument that it was federal jurisdiction, since back then, that the costs were skyrocketing for them. You're saying there was an exchange, there was conversation leading up to this decision, because in a letter from Minister Lametti, he said, he says, I'm receipt of correspondence from March 15th and May 7th from your predecessor concerning legal aid in Ontario. I regret the delay in responding. So was there not a delay?
There was a delay in the written response. There were conversations that were had when Minister Lametti had made visits to Toronto, for example. He had had a sit-down with Caroline Mulroney about various issues. We had heard issues about the gravity of the situation from elected representatives, but obviously the impact of the legal aid cuts were only announced in the provincial budget from the Attorney General of Ontario that was rendered, I believe, in April, and that's when we heard a chorus of really a lot of concern from a lot of stakeholders, whether those are stakeholders in my community or Parkdale High Park, other people in Toronto, people across the province, literally people around the country. What we've done is repaired the gap in Ontario, but there's also a gap in BC and in Manitoba, which have all been secured with 100% full funding by the federal government.
Have you fully repaired the gap in Ontario? The province is saying that there's still another $20 million to go.
The province is reacting, and we understand how they are reacting. They are making claims for additional funding. What we've done is address the gap in immigration and refugee legal aid, which is a matter of shared responsibility, again, because of the urgency of the situation. That is now being 100% funded by the federal government for this year.
Why just for this year?
for this year, because what we're hoping is that we will return to the table at federal, provincial, and territorial conferences with the various attorneys generals from around the country, and return to a way of doing business, which is what we have always had, where you have cooperation among different levels of government, where we hear the needs from the different communities, the different provinces. We understand that Ontario is a immigrant receiving province. It's the province that I call home. I came here myself as a refugee. We know that a lot of people descend on cities like Toronto to call home, and that leads to challenges for the justice system. It leads to challenges for the settlement sector, etc. We've always addressed those, but we've also always had a provincial partner cooperating with us, because provincial governments historically have also seen the benefits of settling newcomers, welcoming them, and settling them and integrating them.
But Mr. Bharani, you just called this provincial government morally bankrupt. Do you think you're going to lure them back to the table by calling them things like that?
Well, I'm reacting because personally, that is exactly how I felt, and that view is shared by many of my colleagues in Ottawa of various political stripes. Preying upon marginalized communities is not a way of doing business as elected representatives. It is one thing to make decisions in an effort to pursue deficit reduction. It's a totally different matter, qualitatively and ethically different, when you do it on the backs of marginalized and vulnerable people. We've seen that with the opioid crisis. We've seen that with respect to poverty alleviation. We've seen that with respect to parents that are fighting, who are dealing with children who are experiencing autism. We were seeing it again with legal aid with respect to immigrants and refugees. That, to me, is an ethically problematic and indefensible policy.
You're also, though, your government, when I listened to the entire announcement today, in one breath you are saying that this issue, especially access to justice, should be above partisanship. In the same, the Prime Minister said the fact that we have to be here today, that yet another Conservative government, Doug Ford, is walking away from services to most vulnerable, is really frustrating for me, and I think all Canadians. There was many instances, and you yourself just mentioned them, where you are particularly critical of this government. I understand that's anyone's right, but how much of this is about there being an election, Doug Ford being an opponent of the federal government, that kind of thing?
There's lots of people that speculate about that, Vashti, and what I'll be is quite candid with you. I think people have concerns about announcements being made, about timings of announcements, how close they are to a writ being dropped when a campaign is starting, etc. I think people should analyze this for what it is. We are assisting people who are seeking asylum and safe haven in this country. Those people don't even have status yet. They are not citizens, they are not voters.
But with respect, that budgetary decision was made in April. We're into August right now. We are a month away probably from the writ dropping, right? There are questions around timing because of the timing.
Fair enough, and those questions can exist, and that's important that people are posing those questions. What I would respond in terms of people who are raising those questions is that what we are doing is responding to an urgent need. We are seeing the cuts that were announced by the Ford government in April manifesting now with the hearings that are occurring now. We know the Doug Ford government understands that refugees who are facing claims in front of the Immigration and Refugee Board, when they are unrepresented, have a 5% chance of success. That means those claims are doomed to fail and people are doomed to be deported. We think that's a problem. Apparently Doug Ford's government does not. We are stepping in now because the urgency is now. It has nothing to do with an election. It has everything to do with the moral rectitude that needs to be shown and with the access to justice that needs to be provided to these individuals.
All right, I'm out of time, but thank you so much for your time, Mr. Bharani. Really appreciate it. That's Reef Irani for us out of Toronto.
Thank you.
Welcome back. Before the break, we heard from the federal government on its one-time funding injection to help support legal aid for immigration and refugee claimants. Ottawa says it's providing $26.8 million to replace cuts made by the Ford government. But the province says the federal government should have assumed responsibility long ago. So who should be picking up the tab? Doug Downey is Ontario's Attorney General. He joins us now from Queen's Park. Hi, Mr. Downey. Great to have you on the show. Thanks for your time.
Hi, I'm actually glad to be here.
So according to the Constitution, and the federal government insists, immigration and refugee claimants are shared between federal and provincial governments. There is shared jurisdiction. So the province should be paying a portion of legal aid costs for refugees, correct?
Well, there are parts of immigration and refugee items that are shared, but in this instance, it's purely federal. It's a federal tribunal. Feds have control over policies as it relates to refugees. So in this instance, it actually is federal.
How do you come to that conclusion? What evidence do you have to support that?
Well, there's a Supreme Court case, Singh, which came out that clarified that.
That's my understanding, and we asked your office for that case, is that's a 1985 decision. I looked through it. I am by no means a legal expert. I saw no mention of specifically legal aid or even specific services as they pertain to refugees. So what is it in that decision that makes you say that legal aid specifically is only federal jurisdiction?
Well, let's go to the conduct of the federal government so far. There are 3 provinces that are funded 100% and have been. We have other provinces that are 70 to 90% funded, and Ontario is being funded at 35%. So if we want to talk about, we can get into legal stuff, but this is really about course of conduct.
So, but which is it then? Are you saying that they should do this because of the Supreme Court or because of what they're doing with other provinces?
I'm saying they should do it on both halves.
So what exactly is the problem with other provinces? Because my understanding is, that most provinces there still is there is cost sharing. So the federal government does provide some top-ups. In fact, in this announcement today, they increased some top-ups. There's a line in the federal budget that has money allocated to legal aid, but that because, refugees eventually, for example, once they do become successful claimants, will pay taxes in the province, it's also provincial jurisdiction.
Well, let's talk sense of magnitude. So Manitoba received a top-up to 100%. They were shorted $200,000. That's not the same magnitude of the $25 million that we were shorted.
So you're just saying this, I just want to be clear, then the argument is that because it's more money that Ontario needs?
No, I'm saying that Ontario was getting 35 cents on the dollar and Manitoba was getting 90%. They're getting 90 cents on the dollar. BC, they received about 1.5 million and Ontario now has received 25 million. But that's a one-time piece. It's only one time.
So is there a magic point at which the provincial government will say, okay, that's the right amount of funding that the federal government should pay? Because we've gone from an argument where they should be paying all of it because the Supreme Court said so to, well, they give other provinces more. So what exactly, do you want them to assume all of it and anything short is not good enough? Or can they do what they do for Manitoba, for example, and as you say, give them, 9 of every 10 cents?
Well, I think the right number is 100%. And I think the federal government's recognized that today. And they feel the pressure of not doing their part for this system.
But don't they feel the pressure on the backs of people who are, some of this society's most vulnerable?
They would have me take money from family legal aid clients and criminal legal aid clients and move it over into the immigration world, which is solely their responsibility in this instance.
But you've already cut money from those people too. Your budget went down 30%, and that wasn't particular to the refugee and immigration system.
We have some tough decisions to make, and I met with the chair of legal aid this morning, and we're continuing to have those discussions and consultations as it relates to legal aid generally. But when we talk federal jurisdiction, they should be here 100%. And that's what I wrote them about, and that's what I asked them for over a month ago. And my predecessor asked them for since March. So we've been consistent in our position that they should fund the federal portion of their responsibilities.
But the way that you're saying they sort of made this announcement because they felt the pressure. I mean, the pressure is that the system is, people who are in the system are not having representation and not able to get representation. And the federal minister or parliamentary secretary just now said that 5% of refugee claimants, only 5% will be successful without representation. Like, is the pressure that they're feeling and that you're saying, oh, it's they're feeling this pressure, like, is it on the backs of society's most vulnerable?
It would be on the backs of society's most vulnerable. Those that need legal aid, family help, and those that need legal aid, criminal help, it would be on their backs. And so
isn't that your responsibility as well? I mean, that's not good if governments are fighting and people caught in the middle who are the most vulnerable are suffering.
This is why I want consistent, stable funding year over year and not a one-time piece.
But what about the responsibility that the province bears for that? I mean, in the meantime, they have come up with some funding, but that's only one time. What's going to happen next year?
You're going to have to ask the Prime Minister that question. He set this up so that we're getting a one-time announcement a couple of months before an election.
But what about the province? I mean, I'm just confused about what the rationale is here, because you're on one hand saying that this is only the federal government's responsibility because a Supreme Court decision leads you to that. Then it's something to do with the way that other provinces are treated. Now, because of pressure, they're stepping in. I mean, I'm just wondering at the end of the day, and I ask the same questions of the federal minister, but at the end of the day, if there are these vulnerable people who are suffering, in your province, does the province not bear some responsibility?
We bear a responsibility to run a legal aid system, which we are. And so we are the conduit for that representation, but the funding and the cost for the federal decisions need to be federal responsibility.
If the jurisdictional portion of this is your justification for cutting this particular aspect of legal aid, what's the justification for the rest of the cuts that you made?
We have the Auditor General's report, and we can dig deeper into some of the challenges that we have in legal aid, but we're working very hard to protect those who need the service on the front line.
But what does that mean? I mean, you're still cutting $133 million in this budget from legal aid. Are you restoring any of that money?
I think you're going to have to stay with us through the consultations. Again, I met with the chair of the Legal Aid Board this morning, and I have consultations throughout this week. We're meeting with clinics, which are very important. We're meeting with service providers, duty council, and stakeholders throughout the legal system.
And what is the timeline for making a decision on that?
Well, I think that we're making a series of decisions after consultations, and we're having consultations this week. I think you'll hear more from us in the fall and the winter and in the days ahead.
I just want to be clear, though. Does that mean that you are open to restoring some of that funding, or are those cuts final?
I think the government's made a decision, and we're having conversations to make sure that every dollar that gets spent is maximized in the front line. And I can add, I used to take legal aid certificates as a practicing lawyer. So I have a good sense of who those vulnerable population are and who we're trying to serve.
And who are they? Not refugees?
Refugees are a federal responsibility that should be funded by the federal government.
Except for the Constitution says it's a shared responsibility.
We're doing our part in terms of all sorts of other areas. And in fact, the federal government owes us a ton more money that we haven't been talking about for housing and social services. But that's a whole other discussion.
All right, we'll leave that for another time. Thank you so much, Mr. Downey. That's Ontario's Attorney General Doug Downey from Queen's Park.
We shouldn't be having to make this announcement. I think far too many people in this room and indeed around the country are trying to forget as much as they can about the Harper years. So the fact that we have to be here today to recognize that yet another Conservative government, the government of Doug Ford, is walking away from services to the most vulnerable is really frustrating. I mean, Conservative politicians like to say they're for the people, but then they end up cutting services for the most vulnerable. It's what they do.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau took more shots at Ontario Premier Doug Ford, as you heard there, invoking his name while announcing $27 million for legal aid programs in order to help process refugee and immigration claims. The feds have chosen to step up to the plate, he said, due to Ford's cuts. The move comes after the province wrote to the feds saying Ontario receives fewer federal dollars despite welcoming more newcomers. So is the Ford-Trudeau battle going to continue until Election Day? Well, it's time, of course, for the Power Panel to weigh in. In Toronto, Brad Levine is a principal at Council Public Affairs. In Montreal, David Hertel is former Quebec Liberal Immigration and Environment Minister. And here with me in Ottawa, Rachel Curran is a former Director of Policy to Stephen Harper, now with Harper and Associates. Hi, everybody. Great to see you.
Hello.
Brad, why don't I start with you? So this is an interesting one, even just coming off the discussion with Eric, who talked about how for the first time in the vote efficiency, we are seeing a change for the Liberals, and that is almost entirely due to the situation in Ontario. Does the rhetoric today surprise you at all, given that?
No surprises here today. I thought the lead-in clip was interesting that you chose that particular clip. There's about 3 or 4 elements in what Trudeau was saying there that give us a clear indication as to what he's going to run the next election on. If anybody at home was wondering when the next election was going to start, it is on, and today is more proof to that. Mentioning the Premier of Ontario by his first name, talking about Harper years, going back to that, trying to paint Scheer as Harper 2.0 or a continuation of Stephen Harper's policies. Those are all clearly designed for his framing of the next election. Should Ford have cut legal aid? He should not have. Should the feds have stepped in? They were right and proper. And when you hear Mr. Trudeau say, "Oh, it's so frustrating," no, he wrote in, cut the check, and he'll probably be repeating today's announcement multiple times for maximum political communications gain.
And we had a Reef Irani, David, on the show, the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Justice, who insisted this did not have anything to do with the election. The timing was not suspect at all. I mean, he did, he made the case for the what he saw as the validity of the funding injection and the reasons for it. But at the same time, as I put to him, it's hard to ignore the timing here. The original letter sent from the province was actually back in March, a month before. And again, there's a debate to be had about the merits of the provincial decision, of course, as well. But that letter was sent back in March prior to the budget. And, the letter I saw back from the federal government came in July. And now this announcement, in the lead up to the election.
You can go even further back because this issue, I was still immigration minister in Quebec when we had this issue, both Quebec and Ontario last year, over a year ago, with the asylum seekers coming through, we had close to 20,000 asylum seekers coming through, mostly in Quebec, but a lot of them went to Ontario. Remember last summer, you had Mayor John Tory of Toronto saying, we need more help, we need more money. He was asking for $80 million because his shelters were full. And at the time, the newly elected Ford government was saying, well, this is a federal problem. And actually, this was Quebec's position since 2017. And even the new Legault government in Quebec has reiterated this position, which was held by the previous Liberal government provincially. But back to Ontario, the Ford government was on the right side of this issue. No pun intended, but because they were putting legal aid, education, housing, healthcare, all of these costs that were generated by an antiquated asylum seeker system that was administrated by the federal government. Now, because of these deep cuts the Ford government announced, now they're on the wrong side of the issue, and the Liberals can pounce on this and take advantage and grow their lead in Ontario.
What about the politics for the provincial government, Rachel? Because the rationale was confusing to me in the interview with the Attorney General, because he's saying on one hand it's a Supreme Court decision from 1985 that says this is all federal jurisdiction. I'm not a legal expert. I understand immigration to be a shared jurisdiction. At the same time, all of this happens while caught in the middle are these people who are seeking a safe haven and trying to make an application in that sense.
Yeah, look, I think we should be clear, none of this should rest on the people who are actually trying to come here and make asylum claims. I've said this over and over again. People who are coming to Canada to seek a better quality of life are not the ones who should be blamed for the situation that we're in now. That said, there's been a recent increase in the number of people, again, who are crossing the border. Governments are totally unprepared to deal with this. As David says, the system is completely antiquated. There are backlogs now of 2 years plus to hold refugee hearings to just determine whether these asylum claims are legitimate or not. There's nowhere for these people to be housed. Increasingly, they're ending up in homeless shelters in Toronto and Montreal and elsewhere. So it's a real problem. And what's frustrating, I guess, is that, look, Justin Trudeau's gone out and said, I'm gonna put a few more million into legal aid. That's great, and it's a great political positioning vis-a-vis Doug Ford. It's going to do very little to address these backlogs and actually reduce the number of people who are waiting in line to hear their claims. And so he's doing this entirely for political reasons. Doug Ford is the best foil that Justin Trudeau could possibly have. He wants to fight this election in Ontario against Doug Ford. So he's going to look for every opportunity.
Given those numbers that we've seen with Eric that he just presented, though?
Yeah,
that's the thing,
I think
right?
so. I think so. I mean, this works out for him really well. Battleground Ontario, this is where the election is going to be fought. And he doesn't want to fight against Andrew Scheer in Ontario. He wants to fight against Doug Ford.
He didn't even say Andrew Scheer's name today. I listened to her. I might have missed something, but I heard Doug Ford, and his opening, as Brad said, his opening statement was about Stephen Harper.
Yeah, absolutely. This is who he really wants as an opponent, as a foil in Ontario, is Doug Ford. And so I think we'll see lots of these kinds of announcements, which are designed to position himself in opposition to Doug Ford. What's particularly cynical about this one, though, is it does absolutely nothing to better the situation of asylum seekers or deal with the problem of refugee claimants coming over the border and how we're dealing with that. But it plugs the hole for legal
aid funding so that people who are in the system can at least have representation.
Sort of. I mean, it's a fairly minimal amount of money. It's not exactly a huge amount of money. So, look, will it speed up hearings at all? I think that's pretty minimal. But it allows Trudeau to get up and do this sort of act where he positions himself sort of in opposition to Doug Ford, which I think is what he's going to want to do throughout this election campaign.
Brad?
Well, I was just going to say that the Ontario government cited around $25 million was the shortfall that they claimed that the feds were not participating in. So in that case, it is going to help, and I think I think that the Ontario government should claim some victory here. They shouldn't have cut. Doug Ford should not have cut legal aid to begin with. But in terms of getting the feds more resources, we've talked about it on this panel a year ago. We talked about the provinces needing the resources. What with the increase in folks coming to Canada to make those claims. But the problem is that this is not good policy because it's not permanent. And it's just going to get Trudeau after the over the hump for the next election campaign.
Nobody could answer what happens next. Neither.
If we want to, well, you put in permanent, ongoing permanent funding that's adequate as opposed to the one-time top-ups. Provinces can't plan properly.
Quick final word, David, then I got to take a break.
Well, this is a Band-Aid. You need a restructuring, complete restructuring of the immigration system if you're really going to address this situation that's going to go on for the following years.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.